You're listening to the Jan Price Show, and today my guest is Nancy Buirski, and we're talking about her new documentary, A Crime on the Bayou. Nancy, thank you for coming on the show. It's great to have you here.
It's great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. I thought this documentary was just superb. Everything, the cinematography, the music, all of the interviews. It was so beautifully put together. And I really, really loved it. And I have lots and lots of questions for you before we get started. But so our audience knows what this documentary, A Crime on the Bayou, is all about. Why don't you give us a brief synopsis?
Happy to. This is a story of Gary Duncan, a 19-year-old Black fisherman from Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, in 1966, who stops on the side of the road as he sees four white boys harassing two younger Black boys. And he stops to see what he can do to stop the fight. And in the process of doing this, he touches the white boy's elbow and he gets arrested for battery, for touching a white boy's arm. This is in 1966 in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, a parish that is effectively ruled by a white supremacist named Leander Perez. And this is right around the time that the schools are being integrated. Perez is very unhappy about this. And he decides he's going to make a model. He's going to make an example of Gary Duncan. So he has him arrested. And there's actually a criminal trial against Gary Duncan. I probably shouldn't tell you too much more about it, but the absurdity of all of that, I'm sure, is evident as I tell the story. But we take that story, we put it on a larger canvas, and we help people understand what was going on during that time. A young Jewish attorney steps in to work with Gary Duncan and help him during this trial. He had come to Louisiana to work on civil rights cases, working very closely with the most radical Black law firm in the area named Collins, Douglas, and Eli. And he himself gets arrested, which just increases the absurdity of all of this. And I don't mean to make light of it, because this was traumatic for everybody involved. Mm-hmm. Gary Duncan was traumatized. Richard Sobol was terrified of being in jail, in a Southern jail. And again, the rest of the story comes out in the film, but that's pretty much the outline of it.
Well, it is so, again, it's so well done, and the story is so well told. I'm always curious as to why someone is attracted to a certain project. So how did this project get into your consciousness, and what made you decide that you needed to do a documentary about this story? Because it is a very powerful story.
Well, thank you for asking. I did learn about Gary Duncan's story through a book that was being written by a gentleman named Matthew Van Meter. The book was eventually called Deep Delta Justice. I read the proposal for this book and I was fascinated by it because it tied very closely to other films I had made already. I started my filmmaking career with The Loving Story, which is the story of Mildred and Richard Loving, an interracial couple who were married in 1958 in Virginia. They'd actually gone to Washington, D.C. to get married because they knew they weren't allowed to get married in Virginia, but they went to Washington, D.C., they got married, they came back and they lived in Virginia, and they were arrested for miscegenation. So in between those two films, I made a film called The Rape of Recy Taylor. This is a film about a Black woman in 1944 in Alabama who gets gang raped by 6 white boys. She has the courage to stand up and accuse her attackers. That was never done then. It put everybody at risk. It put her at risk. It put her family at risk. But she had to stand up for herself. So she is like Mildred Loving and Gary Duncan. All 3 of them actually stand up against a corrupt system. And so it's, even though these situations are very dissimilar, the themes that run through them, the politics and the culture and the sociology that we're looking at, very much the same. So you asked me why I made this film. You know, at first I was worried that I might be going back to the same story too many times. But when I realized how beautifully they interwove with each other's themes, I felt I had no choice but to make this one, and they became effectively a trilogy.
Yes, they really are. They definitely are. And then your film about the Lovings became a film. Um, you know,
Yeah, the documentary became a narrative
e-
film, a feature
exactly.
film called
Yes,
Loving.
yeah, and it was a well-told story. And I know your documentary was even better than the film itself. So one of the questions in when I was doing the research, and you asked this question, is why should uh, someone who's white tell the stories of Black people? These are all, every one of these stories that you've chosen to delve into, obviously, are about Black people. So why do you feel a white filmmaker should be making these films and telling these stories?
I am, first of all, let me say that I don't feel a white filmmaker should tell them. I think that sometimes one is compelled to tell it. One feels very strongly about the stories, partly because I believe white people are complicit in these stories. If it weren't for the way white people treated Black people during all three of these instances, and we see this today as well, obviously it's all connected to what we're looking at today, we wouldn't have these tragedies. And so, though I know, Black people feel very strongly about working hard to change the system, I feel like white people need to be engaged in changing the system as well. In the case of Gary Duncan's story, Gary Duncan really tells his story. This is his story to tell, and what I've done is provide a platform for him to do that. Do I shape it into a larger story and help us understand some of the more abstract ideas that surround the story? Yes, and I think that's important to do, whether you're white or Black, because I think that we're talking about institutions and systems and the law. The law is a very big part of this story. So I think basically everybody should feel some responsibility to address these stories. I think white people definitely have a responsibility to do that. But I don't feel I own these stories. I know that that's a big question. Who owns these stories? Who gets to tell them? I hope it's our characters who are really telling these stories. It's their stories.
And also, too, just what you're saying about, white people need to take a responsibility too. And I, you might be, your perspective is, any director is going to have a different perspective on each project, obviously, but your perspective is going to be different. And I agree with you. There's no doubt about it that all of us need to be working together for the changes that need to be made. I mean, and it's interesting in watching your film, which took place in 1966 and beyond, how things haven't really changed as much as we think they have. They have in many ways, but in many others, they have not.
I know.
And your film is just timely about that. Just the timing of this film couldn't be better because it is exactly some of the same things that are going on.
Right. We talk about microaggressions where Black people, feel literally every day as they walk out of their house, the minute they walk out, they feel some kind of abuse and some kind of racism. And, Gary Duncan, who really didn't commit a crime at all,
No.
is the victim of that kind of abuse. I think the fact that this is a less sensational crime, unlike the rape of Reese Taylor and the arrest of Richard and Mildred Loving, and they're banished from the state of Virginia for 25 years. This seems small in comparison, but it really isn't, because it represents all these hundreds of thousands of microaggressions that Black people feel daily. And he did get thrown into jail, and he could have pleaded guilty, and he chose not to because he wanted to stand up to this system. So I think whether the crime is big or small or not a crime at all, they're all connected, and we're seeing this happening daily.
And we just have the bravery of him to
Yes.
decide, it would have been the easy way out. And I know many people would have, definitely would have, just to get it over with, be done with it and all of that. But he stood up for his rights, and so wonderful that Richard Sobol. So let's talk about him, because you were blessed to have him in this film. I would say, because he passed away, right after you finished filming?
Yeah, he did know. Well, he actually saw the film. He saw
You
the
saw
film
the film. Good. Okay.
and died actually a month later. And
Wow.
I understand from his family that that was one of his happiest days. So that meant so much to me. But he's courageous as well.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Gary Duncan certainly is at more risk than a white attorney who comes into Louisiana to practice law there. But he was practicing law without a license, and Leander Perez, this white supremacist who was kind of the villain of our piece,
Right.
uses that as a reason to arrest him. I think many white supremacists um, look at Jews in not quite the same way as they do blacks, but they really find them abhorrent. And this is where a lot of anti-Semitism comes into play today. We're seeing a lot of it today. They felt that Jews were the ones that were organizing the blacks and making everybody's life so difficult because the Jews were coming in and taking advantage of the situation. I think that other people would say that the Holocaust had only happened. This is in 1966. The Second World War ends in 1945. It's only 20 years earlier. So that's pretty fresh in the minds of a lot of Jewish citizens. And I think they do truly feel a connection to much of the suffering that the Blacks are experiencing. We say in the film, of course, that white Jewish lawyers could do things that Blacks couldn't think about doing in the South. And so there is a distinction. But there's a distinction with perhaps not so much of a difference because the Jews really they did feel some risk as well.
Well, of course, the Jewish people have felt persecuted as well as the blacks. So there's, they identify with that persecution that's taken place.
And I think you can easily, I just want to emphasize the fact that, in our film, we say this, and I know people would agree that, Jews have been feeling persecuted for centuries, but they still have a white skin.
Right.
And the Black people don't. And there is just a different, it's much, much harder for the Black community to deal with some of these issues.
Oh, 100%, 100%. What you've got some really amazing people involved in this film. John Legend is one of the producers. How did he become involved with this?
John Legend and his company Get Lifted does take an interest in documentaries, and one of our colleagues, another producer, introduced it to his company, and they looked at it and they loved it. I think the thing that most attracted John Legend to it, and he'll be talking about this, I think, in the course of our release, is the allyship that he saw between Gary Duncan and Richard Sobol. That friendship, that allyship is the heartbeat of our film. And it represents a larger allyship that we've seen over the years. We certainly saw it in the 60s, and it's received a new kind of scrutiny today during Black Lives Matter. But I think that many people believe that things aren't going to change, or certainly not change rapidly enough, if people don't come together to fight these corrupt systems. And I think that that's one of the things that moves him very much.
Yes, and we did see that last summer, despite the pandemic, with all of after the George Floyd murder, white and black getting together, all nationalities, creeds, colors, everything. And it was during a pandemic of all times to be out in
Yeah,
the streets
yeah.
marching all over the country. So I think there is a pulling together. And I think, again, we need sometimes, in our public life, like the murder of George Floyd, but we're seeing it over and over again. It doesn't stop with many others, Ahmaud Arbery, many, many, many more, to raise our consciousness again about it, to, have for us to all look at it again, as human beings and what
That's
we
right.
want to do with this.
What really connects us is our common humanity. And I think that I hope our film does give one some hope for that kind of change. It's all too slow, obviously.
Yes.
And I think our film makes that point as well, but it does give you some hope.
Yeah, when you look at this is 1966 when this incident happened, and here we are, you know, and the archive photos. Now that was I love that. How did you come up? How did you find all of these wonderful photos that were archived and asked in all the interviews? Because there was a lot. You had the audio of the actual trials. How did you find all of that?
Well, fortunately, those trials were recorded. And so we actually, I should say, the transcripts of the trials existed.
Okay.
We did those, with the audio is ours. We had actors read those parts in the trials. The audio from the Supreme Court is all recorded. Anyone can go and listen, go on to oye.com, and they can listen to any Supreme Court hearing. I mean, we used it in the Loving Story as well. So that's always available to people if they're interested. The photographs were researched we have a wonderful researcher named Hannah Shepard, as well as Vanessa Martino works for us at Augusta Films. And we were able to dig deep and find those many photos. They are used to represent the time and the place and the people. They are not necessarily the exact people we're talking about. But because we're trying to put this on a larger canvas, we feel that kind of thing does work.
That, that obviously, it was really interesting to look at everything that you have in this film that's been archived, and obviously it does make a difference when you're able to have that. I've seen lots of documentaries where you use some artwork in there, but I've seen more lately that are using more and more of that technique to represent the story. But you've been able to come up with a lot of wonderful archived photos. Also, I noticed in the credits Martin Scorsese was involved in this. How did he get involved?
He's an advisor to me on this film.
Aren't you lucky? Not bad to have Martin Scorsese as your advisor. So,
Very generous.
very generous, very generous. And then I love the way you ended. I've always been, since I was a little girl, that you must watch the credits. I've always when I had a friend who was an actor when I was younger, and he said, the movie's not over until the credits are over. And whenever I go to the movies, I tell my friends, like, if you want to get up after the movie's over, go, but I'm going to stay for the credits. Then there's always a nice little, sometimes there's some little piece of advice or something at the end of the credits. And you do that beautifully with a quote from John Lewis.
Yes, he reminds you that we should always look back and study history because we keep repeating these problems over and over again. And it did feel right at the end of the credits. But another thing under the credits that I want to point out is that we have an original song.
Yes.
Written by Raphael Sadiq. And we're thrilled with the song. They're going to be releasing that as a single on the same day as our film opens theatrically, which is June 18th. And so people can listen to it either, on YouTube or Spotify, but please listen to it when you watch our film, because if you watch our film and you sit through the credits, you'll hear his song, it's called My Path, and we just love it.
Oh, it's beautiful. It really is beautiful. And that it gives you a reason to want to sit through the credits to listen to the song, for sure. But let's talk about the music now that you brought the music up, because the music is just wonderful and perfect with the tone of this documentary.
Thank you. Most people would expect to hear blues or some kind of soul music or music that's indigenous to Louisiana. And there was something about the footage that I was looking at that just made me feel cool jazz. And I really can't explain it. Maybe because the story itself is a little bit unexpected, and there's a little bit of cynicalness to it when you realize the irony of Gary Duncan being arrested for touching a white boy's arm. So yeah, we use a little Chet Baker, we use some Miles Davis, we use some Mingus. In the beginning of the film, primarily, there's also a beautiful score by Virgil Thompson, which was written for the Louisiana story. And we have a little bit of footage from the Louisiana story. So it was somewhat coincidental that, I was watching the Louisiana story, I was listening to the music, I tried putting it into the beginning of the film, and it just worked beautifully. So it was a wonderful way to honor that film, which is by Robert Flaherty, and the Virgil Thompson score, which threads itself through the film. There's also a moment where we hear Randy Newman's incredible song called Louisiana 1927, which was written in recognition of the flood of 1927. And water becomes a metaphor in our film as well. So once again, these things kind of fold themselves into the story, and that's part of the fun of making these movies, is weaving it all together.
Yes. How long did it take you to film this?
Well, you start, you do a set of interviews, and then you come back and look at them and think about them. And then you go back and do another set of interviews. And of course, I'm not alone. I have a wonderful team working with me, Claire Chandler and Vanessa Martino and Rex Miller, who shot it, and various sound people were at these shoots. And then I would work with my editor, Anthony Rapoli, and it takes a few years for it all to come together, because sometimes you do parts of it and then okay, then now you have to record the courtroom scenes, so that happens at another time. It's all spread out.
So you've done three of these, what you're calling your trilogy. Um, do you, what did you, for you, because each one is unique and different, what did you learn from each one of these stories? How did it change you and your life?
Well, it certainly made me feel like I was doing something valuable, because I felt like these stories were really important to tell. And not that I don't value filmmaking as a profession, I do. But when you can make a film that communicates these kinds of messages and helps an audience empathize with people like Gary Duncan and Mildred Loving and Reese Taylor, it does give you a sense of purpose, which is really important. Um, I was reminded that anybody can change history. You have these people that did not set out to change history, were not activists, and they do, just by dint of their moral character. So that was a very important thing. I was also very impressed with resilience, and that comes up in a couple of my other films as well. That it takes a certain kind of inner strength to be able to stand up to um, systemic racism, to corrupt culture, and even to accidents of life that afflict you, and you find yourself in a situation such as my film Afternoon of a Fawn, about a ballet dancer who's stricken with polio. She has to learn to live with polio. She can't dance anymore, and her resilience was really courageous and inspiring. So I guess I'm attracted to those stories, but if anything has impacted me, it's that kind of theme.
Do you have something else you're working on currently?
We are actually just beginning to develop a film on Midnight Cowboy. The
Oh,
film that was made in 1967. There's a new book out by Glenn Frankel, and we have optioned the book. And I, with two other producers, Susan Margolin and Simon Kilmurray, and I are beginning to develop this project, and we're really excited about it. It's not going to be the making of Midnight Cowboy. It's more the universe of Midnight Cowboy. How the culture of that time impacted that film, and how that film impacted the culture, and how films can actually be life changing.
yes, definitely. That's what I say all the time on this show. Exactly that one. I can't wait to see that one too. So I'll have to have you back on the show once you get that one completed. Where can people see this film, Nancy? A Crime on the Bayou.
Thank you so much for asking. We are opening theatrically on June 18th in New York and in LA, in Beverly Hills and Pasadena. We are opening in various other places around the country, and I encourage people to come onto our Facebook page, A Crime on the Bayou, where we will be announcing all the other theaters that will be showing the film. And we'll also send our viewers to a microsite, which will have a lot more. Our distributor has a microsite, that's Shout Factory. And then eventually it will be digitally available. That will be sometime in August. And then in the fall, it will be on TV. I'm not sure I can announce that yet, but in November, it will be available on cable television.
Wonderful. Well, everybody, Nancy, so much. Thank you so much for being on the show. And everybody, please seek out A Crime on the Bayou. It is just a really excellent documentary, and you'll learn a lot, and it will touch you and maybe motivate you to get more actively involved in what's going on right now in our world. So, Nancy, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Really my pleasure, Jan. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have missed any of the Jan Price shows, all about movies, you can go to my website, thejampriceshow.com. You can also go to the iHeart Podcast Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, anywhere where you get your podcast. You can also go to our YouTube channel too. So thank you all for listening.